Thank you for joining us in this podcast number 11 of our series, Colonies to Colossus, The Rise of a Giant. In this podcast, we'll take a look at colonial New York. England's North American colonies are usually clumped into three broad geographic groupings. From Virginia and Maryland south were the southern colonies. North of that were the middle colonies, which included Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And then further north were the New England colonies. New York is usually clumped into the category of the middle colonies. But I think New York is different enough that it probably deserves to be in a category all by itself because its history is so different than the others. A thick veneer of English place names in New York today mostly conceals the fact that New York was originally settled by the Dutch and remained a Dutch colony for nearly half a century before the English took it over in 1664 without firing a single shot. New York's unique geographic features allowed rapid commercial development. Some of the most important events of the War of Independence occurred in New York, and New York was the site of the first capital of the United States after the Constitution was ratified. It was also the place where George Washington took the first presidential oath of office. Today, New York is a giant among the world's commercial centers of activity. Of the original 13 colonies, it is now the most populated. Before we talk about how the Dutch settled New York, it would be a good idea to talk about some of the key geographic features of New York. The most important of these would be the Hudson River. The Hudson River is not a long river compared to most other rivers, but the important point about it is that the Hudson River is deep. That means that it's navigable even by very large ships for hundreds of miles. North of the Hudson River is Lake George and Lake Champlain. Combined, the Hudson River and these two lakes make a very good navigable waterway system that not only gives New York access to Canada, but also to the powerful Iroquois Confederation, which lived in western and central New York at the time. The Iroquois were probably the most powerful of the Indian nations that the colonists encountered in North America, and we'll do a separate podcast down the road just on them because I think they're important. Of all the nations from Europe that were engaged in colonization of North America, the Dutch were the only ones that did not have a king. Instead, they had a national government that was formed of representatives from the various constituent states that made up the Netherlands. This assembly was called the States General, and it acted as a national government. The States General granted a very generous charter to the Dutch West India Company, which was a combination of Dutch investors and businessmen. This charter allowed the West India Company to engage in all kinds of commercial activity. It gave them a monopoly on everything going on in the Atlantic Ocean, from the west coast of Africa to the east coast of the Americas. Not only could they engage in commercial activity, but it also gave them power to set up colonies and to govern the colonies. So while Englishmen were busy setting up colonies in New England, the Dutch West India Company was busy settling an area of North America that they called the New Netherlands. The boundaries of this Dutch colony extended from the Connecticut River Valley up in the northeast down south into what is today the state of Delaware. The most important town established in the New Netherlands by the Dutch was called New Amsterdam. It was built on the southern end of an island that the Indians called Manhattan. Many of the colonists commented on the sweet smell that came from the wildflowers and grasses that grew naturally in the area. Later, when the English captured New Amsterdam, they called it New York, or renamed it New York, which is the name it still has today. Situated at the mouth of the Hudson River, New Amsterdam was in a good location to control trade into the interior, and it was also a halfway point between New England and England's other colonies. The other important town that the Dutch founded in New York was called Beverwyck, which in Dutch means Beaver Town. Beverwyck was located over 100 miles north of New Amsterdam, right on the banks of the Hudson River. Beverwyck was in an ideal situation to tap into trade with the powerful Iroquois Confederation, as well as the other Indian tribes, and to be a halfway point between Canada and the English colonies. Beaver pelts were an important part of the Dutch trade. They were an important commodity item, and the Indians were willing to supply beaver pelts in exchange, especially for firearms and other metal objects that they couldn't on their own create. In fact, beaver pelts were so important that the beaver appears on the official colony seal of New Netherlands. After the English captured the colony of New Netherlands from the Dutch, they renamed Beverwyck Albany, which is the name it retains today, and Albany serves as the state capital for the state of New York to this day. It wasn't always easy to find colonists willing to leave Europe to go settle in a raw wilderness. And in fact, the Dutch had a very tolerant attitude at home about religion, so there wasn't a compulsion for many people hoping to find religious freedom to leave Holland. Some of the colonists that came to the New Netherlands were from other countries, such as Norway and England. One of the incentives that was used to try and get people to migrate over to the New Netherlands was the offering of patroonships. What this was that if you migrated over when you brought 50 people with you and you were a qualified entrepreneur, you could be given a slice of land along the Hudson River and you would be allowed to rule it almost as a feudal lord, somewhat like you would in a medieval manor. Probably the most successful of these patroonships belonged to the Van Rensselaer family. And in fact, today there's a county along the Hudson River in New York called Rensselaer, which echoes the fact that that family once existed and had some influence in the area. The Dutch were highly commercially oriented. One witness who lived at that time described them in these words. He said, "The Dutch must be understood as they really are. The middle persons in trade, the factors and brokers of Europe. They buy to sell again, take in to send out, and the greatest part of their vast commerce consists in being supplied from all parts of the world, that they may supply all parts of the world." And indeed, the Dutch did become one of the greatest commercial nations in the world during their time. To them, business was business, and it was kept somewhat separate from their personal lives. This is reflected in the way they had slavery. The Dutch had black slaves in New York, but instead of them being owned by one owner like they were in the English colonies in the South, they were actually in a way kind of rented out by the company for blocks of time to whoever needed them. The town of New Amsterdam, which later became New York City after the English captured it, was one of the first towns to give names to some of its streets. One of the first maps drawn of New Amsterdam was drawn by Jacques Cortelyou, a French Huguenot who had fled to the New World and become part of the Dutch colonies. That's for you, Chuck. Interestingly, on Cortelyou's map, you can see the wall that ran from one side of Manhattan Island to the other side, and the street that was just behind this defensive wall was called Wall Street, which is a name it still retains to this day. So the way that the Dutch laid out their streets in this early period is still influencing the way these streets run in New York City to this day. Walking around these parts of New York today, you would never know what those streets once looked like. They were muddy and foul and described as very smelly and dirty, and the pigs running wild and other livestock wandering around the town. The Dutch carried on quite a bit of trade with the Indians, as I mentioned earlier, but with two cultures so vastly different, it was inevitable there would be misunderstandings and frictions, and there were. These frictions eventually resulted in war, and the frictions went both ways. Dutch livestock often wandered off out into Indian cornfields, destroying and trampling Indian corn, and at the same time Indian dogs, which were really more than just wolves, would sometimes kill the colonists' livestock. These kinds of frictions and difficulties probably could have been gotten past until the 1640s when one of the Dutch governors did something stupid. He decided to try and tax the Indians that lived within the boundaries of New Netherlands, and that created an Indian war. Scattered around New Amsterdam, on Long Island, and on Manhattan were bouweries. These were company-owned farms, and that word still rings down through New York history today, too. These were hit particularly hard by Indian raids. It was impossible for the Dutch to defend everywhere, and the Indians could hit and run as they chose. The last of the Dutch governors was a man named PeterStuyvesant. He must have presented an interesting picture. During an attack on a Spanish fort down in the Caribbean, a cannonball took off his lower leg, and so he had a peg leg. Religiously, he was a staunch Calvinist, and he was described as being strong-willed and stubborn. He was very loyal to the Dutch West India Company, and he demanded that people attend church services on Sunday. And just as all the Dutch governors, he could be heavy-handed and a bit autocratic. One of the people who knew him at the time wrote this about him. "Our great Muscovy Duke goes on as usual. He proceeds no longer by words or writings, but by arrests and stripes," meaning whippings. But on balance, Stuyvesant was probably one of the better governors, and he was able to pull off what must have been a very difficult and frustrating job, being the governor of this outpost that really was not that important to the Dutch authorities or to the company that founded it. It was probably just a matter of time before the English either absorbed or conquered the Dutch colonies in North America. English settlers were already moving west from New England and also on Long Island into areas that the Dutch claimed for themselves. They were pushing back the Dutch borders or frontiers. Dutch colonists noticed that the English colonists had a say in their colonies' governments. They elected town councils, and they also sent deputies to the colonial assemblies. The Dutch didn't do this, and it annoyed Dutch colonial officials, who tended to be more autocratic than English ones, that this was going on and being set an example for the Dutch people. For their part, the English government resented having this Dutch colony because it was right in the middle of the Atlantic seaboard of North America. It separated New England from the English southern colonies in Virginia and Maryland. The English king, Charles II, decided to do something about this. He granted to his brother, James, the Duke of York and Albany, Maine, Long Island, and all of the Dutch colonies, including New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. James was also the High Admiral of England, so in 1664 he armed 4 English frigates and sent them to New York or New Amsterdam with 400 soldiers and demanded the surrender of the town. The Dutch governor, PeterStuyvesant, was at first reticent to surrender the town, but the English were offering very generous terms of surrender. They promised not to loot or plunder or confiscate people's property, and since the Dutch were fellow Protestants, the English promised to leave their church alone and let them continue to practice their religious preferences. PeterStuyvesant gave in. His soldiers left the fort at the southern end of Manhattan Island, and he himself walked home to his house just a few blocks away and retired, and an English flag went up over the fort. Without firing a single shot, England had taken over the largest Dutch settlement in the North American colonies. From here, the English sent out other parties to let the other Dutch settlements along the shoreline of New Jersey and Delaware that they were now part of England. James was fairly heavy-handed. He did not allow an assembly or anything of the like. He instead governed the colonies that were now his as proprietor through favored governors. In time, he would allow the people to have an assembly, but that would take a little while. Interestingly, James set up a non-denominational state church. He had to do this because New York had so many different religious groups in it. The governor, Edmund Andros, made this observation about the churches in New York. He said there are religions of all sorts: one Church of England, several Presbyterians and Independents, Quakers and Anabaptists of several sects, some Jews, but Presbyterians and Independents most numerous and substantial. So in a way, New York was in the same position that Rhode Island had been in. In order to get along, they had to just kind of tolerate everyone. A few years later, the Dutch would recapture New York during another war with England, but it only lasted a short time, and in the treaty that ended the war, the Dutch agreed to give it back. New York, and in fact all of the Dutch North American colonies, were never that big of a priority for the Dutch, so they didn't really feel like they were losing too much. While there were some tensions between the Dutch colonists and their new English masters, they really didn't have too much of a difficult time amalgamating. Within a generation, the blending was fairly thorough. The English and the Dutch were both Protestant after all, and they both spoke a distantly related language. New York was becoming an increasingly important commercial center, and would do so under English rule even more. One person who visited the city in those early days mentioned that nearly everyone there owned a shop, who, quote, gained their living by trade, namely in tobacco and liquors, thread and pins, and other knickknacks. The people in this city are almost all traders in small articles. It would come as no surprise then that the first merchants' exchange in America was established for New York City. Ironically, some of the most unhappy people about the English takeover of the Dutch colonies were Englishmen themselves on Long Island. These people on Long Island were Puritans, and they saw themselves as an extension of Connecticut, and if you look at a map, you can see that Long Island is just south of Connecticut. They were not happy when James annexed Long Island to New York to be governed by New York officials who themselves were not Puritan. In conquering the Dutch colonies, England inherited about 6,000 new colonists, a little fewer than 2,000 of whom lived in New York City. Dutch culture lingered for a time just below the surface, though many Dutch colonists were anglicizing their names in an attempt to fit in better. Many of the place names that Dutch people gave to these areas still exist around New York City today. Words like Bowery, Harlem, Bronx, and Brooklyn all hint at New York's Dutch origins. The first few decades of New York's existence as an English colony were very turbulent. The king's brother, James, the Duke of York and Albany, owned the colony up until 1685, and then he became king, and the colony became a royal colony until 1687. At that time, King James attempted to reorganize the colonies, and he crammed New York in with the New England colonies into one big colony called the Dominion of New England. This didn't last very long because James had problems at home, and he ended up having to flee England. This new mega colony that he created was so unpopular with the people in the colonies that they rose up and took control of the governments themselves, and New York was no exception. New York colonists rose up and took over New York and ended up governing it for a year or so until a proper governor could be installed by the new king. One of the events that speaks to how deeply embedded representative government was in the minds of Englishmen has to do with the first legislature of New York, which met in 1683. At that session of the legislature, they produced a kind of combination Constitution and Bill of Rights called the Charters of Liberties and Privileges. This remarkable document borrowed heavily from Magna Carta and early English traditions about liberty and limited government. Unfortunately, James became king and he disallowed the Charters of Liberties and Privileges. After about 1700, New York City began to blossom as a major center of commercial activity in North America. It soon ceased to be a satellite of Boston, and by 1760 would be second only to Philadelphia in population. The early days of fur trading and beaver pelts were soon being replaced by commercial activities and industrial production, such as the production of flour, sugar refining, and naval stores, and there was even a chocolate refinery in distant Albany. Along with a reputation for commercialism, New Yorkers were also gaining a reputation for boorishness and even sacrilegious manners. During this time, New York City began to establish its urban setting that we're today a little bit familiar with. And with those urban settings go all the problems of a major urban population. As early as 1731, the city imported its first fire engine from England. And as early as 1750, there were complaints about air pollution and how bad the city smelled. New York City officials had to deal with all the same things we would think of today in a major urban population setting. Things like crime, clean water supply, dealing with criminal activity such as prostitution, public drunkenness, and also the difficulties of coping with a homeless population. There were also civil disorders from time to time. There were bakers' strikes, and there was also the hysteria caused by a suspected slave revolt. New York City was also home to a major educational institution, back then known as King's College. Today it's now known as Columbia University. As with any urban center, New York had both good and bad things to offer. One visitor during colonial times had this to say about New York. He said, "New York City was a seaport town where great numbers of all sorts of people are collected, good and bad, and I doubt not that the latter will ever be by far the majority." Another person who visited this city in 1750 had a different opinion. He mentioned that in the chief streets there are trees planted, which in summer give them a fine appearance, and during the excessive heat at that time afford a cooling shade. I found it extremely pleasant to walk in the town, for it seemed like a garden. While New York City flourished and grew, just like all the other colonies, the back country had its rustic flavor. In the back country, people enjoyed dining on roasted venison, turkey, goose, and raccoon, with peaches in September, apples in October, melons, and jelly made from grapes, and a lot of consumption of rum. In Albany, some pranksters caused a stir when they hung beaver testicles attached to a bladder from a tree in the front home of a new bridegroom, sort of their way of welcoming a new married couple. One of the more colorful characters in New York's history was a man named Lord Cornbury, who served as that colony's governor from 1702 to 1708. He was vain and pompous, and he granted large tracts of land to favorites whom he could count on to support him, and he often fell into quarrels with the legislature because of his autocratic attitude. Probably what irritated many New Yorkers most was the way in which he wore women's clothing. Cornbury was eventually recalled back to England, and he was eventually thrown into jail, but he must have left a lasting negative impression upon New York, because even as many as 50 years later, one person had this to say about him: "It was not uncommon for him to dress himself in a woman's habit, and then to patrol the fort in which he resided. Such freaks of low humor exposed him to the universal contempt of the people." One of the important events that happened in New York in the 1730s was the trial of John Peter Zenger. Zenger was a printer who printed a newspaper that was highly critical of the governor and some of the others in the leadership positions. He was thrown in jail, but he was acquitted by a jury who were convinced that it was not libelous for him to print the truth. In other words, that truth was a defense to libel. And he won the case, and this is often seen as a very important test case in our freedom of the press. After the French and Indian War, the colonies were resistive to much of the British legislation that tried to tax them or to regulate their economic activities, and New York was no exception. In fact, in 1765, the Stamp Act Congress, which was kind of a forerunner to the Continental Congresses, was held in New York City. And like many of the other urban places in the colonies, New York had severe riots about these stamps. In fact, opposition to the stamp tax was so universal and so intense that it was never actually put into effect. New York City at this time was the headquarters of General Thomas Gage, who was Commander-in-Chief of British forces in North America. So the Stamp Act riots and the inability of the government to put into force the stamp tax was quite an embarrassment to the British as well as to General Gage. That same year, and in the following year, 1766, Parliament passed a couple of quartering acts. These were laws that allowed soldiers to be billeted in private homes or in taverns or other vacant buildings, and of course this met with intense opposition. The legislature of New York was very vocal in its opposition to this, especially since they had so many British troops right there under their noses. And their unwillingness to cooperate forced Parliament to pass another act that would essentially ban the New York legislature from meeting. This became one of the grievances laid out in the Declaration of Independence about the king abolishing legislatures. Luckily for New York, British attention shifted back to Massachusetts after these events because events there were becoming intense in Boston and also with the Concord and Lexington fighting. New York was the scene of an interesting, if not somewhat awkward, situation in 1775. George Washington had just been appointed Commander-in-Chief of the army that was besieging Boston, and he was heading north through New York to take command of the army there. This was in late June of 1775. The very day that Washington rode into town, the royal governor, William Tryon, was returning from England. He had been overseas there for a while. Normally, whenever the governor returned, a company of militia would be out to salute him as he returned and headed back to his headquarters. So one company of militia was appointed to receive General Washington at one end of town, while another was appointed to receive the royal governor at the other end of town. When the Continental Congress voted to declare independence, New York was the only colony to abstain. This is ironic because George Washington, with the Continental Army, was preparing to defend New York at the time, and in fact, he had the Declaration of Independence read to the army out on the Bowling Green in New York City. After the Declaration was read, the troops went and pulled down a statue of the king, melted it down, and turned it into musket balls. During the American Revolution, New York saw more military action than any other state. It was invaded from the west, it was invaded twice from Canada, and in fact the largest battle of the whole war was on Long Island early in the war. New York was also the first site of the first documented submarine attack in history. We talked about that in one of the earlier podcasts. The British recognized the strategic value of New York because it controlled the Hudson River. The British occupied it in 1776. Their goal was to control the Hudson River, and in doing so they could isolate New England from the rest of the colonies. In these early stages of the war, they saw New England as the hotbed of rebellion. During the war, the British had several old ships that they used as prisons. They boarded up the holes in the ship and the windows, and they stuffed them full of prisoners and others that were captured. Conditions in these ships, particularly the Jersey, which has a notorious reputation, were unimaginably foul. In fact, many more men died on these ships than actually died in combat during the War of Independence. New Yorkers complained that when the wind shifted, they could smell the smell from these ships. After the Battle of Yorktown, where the British surrendered, Washington made his headquarters in New York, just a little ways from New York City, so he could keep an eye on the British there, although everyone knew that the inevitable was coming and that the British would probably sue for peace. In 1783, the British signed a treaty recognizing us as an independent nation, and they evacuated New York in November of that year, never to return. In New York City, there's a tavern called Fraunces Tavern, and that was where Washington bid farewell to his fellow officers before he rode off to the Continental Congress to resign his commission as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. After the War of Independence was over, the Constitution was written later, and New York was one of the last states to ratify the Constitution, which is kind of an irony because New York City served as the first federal capital under the federal Constitution that we enjoy today. In closing, I just want to briefly mention three famous New Yorkers at that time. The first of these is Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was a very intelligent man, and he served as the first Secretary of the Treasury under George Washington. And in fact, his picture still is on our $10 bill to this day. Hamilton was a brave soldier who fought during the Revolutionary War and led men into battle at places like Trenton and at Yorktown. Another famous New Yorker was a man named Gouverneur Morris. Morris was one of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention, and it's said that he was the one that actually did the style and writing of the Constitution once they had decided on what they wanted to have in it. He's an interesting character because one of his legs was lost somehow, it was amputated, and he had a peg leg, so he walked around with a peg leg. The last of these I'll mention is a man named John Jay, who along with Alexander Hamilton and James Madison wrote some of the Federalist Papers explaining and defending the Constitution and encouraging people to ratify it. Jay was chosen by George Washington to be the first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, and he later went on to be Governor of New York. Thank you for listening to my podcast. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you're interested in further reading on this subject of colonial New York, I recommend the following books and articles. Colonial New York, A History by Michael Kamen. The Early American Republic, 1789 to 1829 by Paul E. Johnson. The Battle for Brooklyn, 1776 by John J. Gallagher. Chaining the Hudson, The Fight for the River in the American Revolution by Lincoln Diamont. Saratoga, Turning Point of America's Revolutionary War by Richard M. Ketchum. Did the Zenger Case Really Matter? Freedom of the Press in Colonial New York by Leonard Levy. Published in the William and Mary Quarterly, Volume 17, No. 1, January 1960. The First Fiscal Crisis in New York by Lynn Cece. Published in the Economic Development and Cultural Change, Volume 28, No. 4, July 1980. New York's Radicals and the Coming of Independence by Roger J. Champagne. Published in the Journal of American History, Volume 51, No. 1, June 1964. And New York's Place in Intercolonial Politics by Arthur Howland Buffington. Published in the Proceedings of the New York State Historical Association, Volume 16, 1917.